Hi, I'm Cameron Groh. I'm a comic studies student and host of the student radio show In the Gutter on KPSU. And here's the person I'm talking to, Stephen Christian.
How's it going? I'm Stephen Christian. I am a former Portland State pre-med post-bac student. I was also in the comic studies program, and I'm currently a medical student at the University of Nevada, Reno. And I'm a AR developer and a comic book illustrator.
So Stephen, my first question is, what brings you here? What brought you to art? What are the circumstances or the choices that got you sitting in that chair?
Yeah, so it's I don't know, it was a journey. And I feel like every part of the journey that I had, whether it was, I was a former football player, so I played at the University of Hawaii and Oregon State, and I was a big, comic book fan. I used to love the Boondocks, anime, Dragon Ball Z, all that stuff growing up. But I wasn't like a big art kid. And so I ended up having hip surgery twice at the University of Hawaii, and I couldn't play football. That was pretty much like the big thing for me. So I just sort of just sat down when I was recovering. I was in a wheelchair, and I was just like, well, dang, I'm not able to run or anything. I need to do something. I need to be active. And so, instead of using my feet for stuff and my legs for things, I just said, how about using my hands for things? And so, sort of crafty and stuff. So I started to explore what it would look like to be very active in a creative process. And I initially thought, oh yeah, I'm gonna just make a cartoon and animate. And you quickly learn that animation is a lot more labor intensive. It's a lot of drawing. It's a lot of stuff. And so I first started off with comics or visual storytelling, comics and sequential images, and then I slowly moved into the animation space. And so I always joke around that comics is illustration and stuff is fun, but it is a lot. It is a lot. And so, I ended up returning back to the field at Oregon State and then graduating. And when I went through this period of my life where I was trying to figure out what it would be like to be a regular person and not just an athlete, and not a professional athlete, just removing myself from the athletics, I instantly fell back into the creative space again, where instead of trying to learn how to do these things, it became a journey of how do I redefine myself through my art. And so this was during the time of the whole Oscar so white thing and all that, which I feel like it was almost 10 years ago. And I had this idea of just I wanted to see the things represented in the world that related to me and the conditions that I've experienced, right? And so this is pre-Black Panther. There was no representation anywhere, and so I just sort of had a sketchbook, and I was still looking for a job. I was couch surfing, and I just said every single day I'm gonna just create a new. I'll render a new thing that speaks to my ideas, but then represents. Visually represents, me. And so I created this series called Black Superheroes Matter. And it was just taking my favorite superheroes and comic characters and looking at them through the eyes of children of color, Black children. So it was just kind of just Black kids cosplaying in their favorite stuff, right? And making these illustrations. And then this body of work went from one illustration to 300. And I think by that time I moved up here to Portland and got into the pre-med post-bac because I decided to randomly just say, hey, I'm gonna just try to go to medical school. And so
like you do.
Yeah, and then I was introduced to the comic studies program here, and then it became this idea of, okay, I'm pretty familiar with my art style. I'm pretty familiar with the mission of why I'm doing art. And then it was like, okay, what does it look like to try to use the art to tell stories and have an impact? And you know, the work that you see behind me, I mean, that's the manifestation of that. Literally, it's you know, my main character Roscoe that you see, he was the little boy that was cosplaying in those costumes. And so the journey of the journey and the idea of like actually coming up with a story to tell and looking at this world, it really started off from, you know, what does it look like to have the kids that were cosplaying in those costumes go out into the real world and deal with the consequences of just existing in a place that doesn't, you know, look out for their best interests. And I think it really reflected, I mean, it still reflects the times, and it's crazy how it became relevant, or more relevant, because I've been working on this project for, you know, almost 7 years, 8 years, since I moved to Portland. This is my Portland project, and it evolved and it grew with me, and especially as I got deeper and deeper into like the technological part of it, where at the end of the day, you know, I have this story that I've been working on, and any sort of innovations that I wanted to explore, whether it's animation, illustration, coloring, webcomics, or AR, I've always fallen back on these very 8 pages to test out the ideas and see how far I could push them, and then use that as an example to help people, you know, in whatever they need help with. You know, because for me, it's just it's a journey of exploration, but it's also a, you know, leading by example of like, you know, we don't know the potential of Black representation and how that impacts people and why we even need it. But when you see something like this is a manifestation of it, and I think that gets lost on people.
So this piece isn't exactly a magnum opus, but more like it's foundational for you.
Yeah.
Where everything branches off for you.
Yeah, I would say so. I think
you can call it magnum opus if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think this represents a lot, and mainly because I remember when I was down in LA and I was trying to like get a job, and I finished retiring. This is before I moved up to Portland, and I feel like I had this body of work that I built over years that spanned from animation to illustration to graphic design and all that. And for one reason or another, it felt like I was unhireable in any area, any job that I applied to. Just entry-level creative works, right? And one of the things that stood out to me, or one of the things that stuck with me in terms of feedback, was whenever I would go out and send my portfolio, they would always say that, like, you know, they could see that I have skills, but my stuff is all over the place. And they said the best thing that you could do as a creative is to consolidate all your work into one one project, one body of work. And so for me, this is a way, all this stuff that like you see, there's a lot of things that go with it, and these are things that I'm capable of doing and I enjoy doing. And so this really just started off as a project for me to just like get hired on a job, and showing that like I'm able to do things within a project and a team workflow, and I just need an opportunity. And so, you know, working year after year, trying to incorporate these different things so that people see the vision and really just see my skill set to hire me, ended up being this whole, you know, large entailing project that just shows, you know, what I'm capable of. And so it's a, you know, I find it interesting that like I started this and I continued this to be more hireable, and now I didn't really get hireable. I kind of just started my own business, and then now I'm hiring people. So I don't know. It's something that I often reflect on.
It sounds like it worked out, just not in the way you were expecting, but in a way that you're satisfied with, right?
Yeah. I think medical school has definitely changed, you know, altered my expectations, and in a good way. I think that the stuff that I do now, it feels like it's a hobby, a sustainable hobby that has a lot of growth, and that's very reminiscent of how I started. I didn't. The only reason I started working in the area is because people were just willing to pay me.
So from what I can tell, you've been educated all over the place, mostly the Pacific region. You dropped that you'd been in LA, you've been in Portland. I think you're going into medical school in Reno, Nevada, and you also played for University of Hawaii, is that right?
Yep.
How have all those places shaped your perspective on your art or yourself or the world at large? Like, what are your artistic influences?
I think that honestly, my art represents really a lot of the stuff that you mentioned. This series here, it's part of this like webcomic that I started called Island Fever, and I started that when I was in Hawaii. And so, it's not a coincidence that, the whole series is set on an island, because that's exactly how I started it. And I think Hawaii was a very cultural experience. It felt like I've been to like Cabo, I've been to Jamaica, I've been to, the Bahamas, and it felt like you were there, but you're still in America. It's like
tourist feeling.
Yeah, it's like this tourist feel that like, has this like underlying like layers of oppression, and where it's like, this is not what I know growing up, right? And so like, I try to capture that feeling in my work with the environment that I'm building and stuff. But then when it comes to leaving Hawaii and moving on to Oregon State and all that, it became this idea of how can I create impactful work that communicates ideas, and so I started to focus on writing. I was doing stuff with newspapers at that point, and you learn to become more efficient with the amount of art that you input, the amount of just your creative process.
This was cartooning for newspapers?
Yeah.
Ooh.
And so
Where comics began.
Yeah, right. And so it started to evolve to be more efficient with the artistic process, because I was playing football, I was in grad school, and I still wanted to get published every week. And so I had to figure out a process to make that more efficient. And so then after that, I moved more into animation and actually working in the space. And it's like, okay, you got to be good, you have to be vast, and then you still have to be efficient. And so I started to like do all these things to like just become a more well-rounded storyteller and artist. And ultimately, it came down to, once I got introduced to conventions and stuff, by the time I moved out here, then it was like, okay, I need to make something that I can sell. And
sell at the booths at the Traders Hall.
Yep.
The artist alleys.
Oh yeah, artist alleys, different marketplaces, find stuff that's sustainable, that I can afford to sort of scale. And so I think as things went on, I went from like being more of a an artist, and then I evolved to becoming more of a professional artist. And then when the pandemic hit, then it became this idea of, okay, how can you become a professional artist that is a creator at its core, right? And what that means, at least to me, is you create work that's impactful, that you're able to build a community around, and then you also take that and use that as an example to impact the community directly, right? So doing stuff with libraries, making books and donating them to people, and sort of having this community impact. And so the evolution of my art and the inspirations really, they came from just the world around me, I would say. I don't think that this, like the things that I was able to create and the things that I was able to come up with, I don't think they would ever be at the level that they were at if I was working in a vacuum.
Interesting. Looking at the webcomic itself, I noticed that a lot of the environment that your character, Roscoe Thompson, is very heavily detailed, and it doesn't really look, I guess, sanitized is the word I'm going to use. It's heavily detailed. There are cracks in the wall, holes in the sidewalk, the remnants of what I'm guessing are a massive fudge pudding attack. How difficult is it to get that level of detail? And if you'll excuse the presumption, in your own words, why was it worth it to have that level?
I think it's one thing to sort of like when you're reading a book, and you hear about a character walking through an environment and it's unsanitized or it lacks that polish.
It's not living in like a IKEA commercial.
Yeah, right. It's a, but when you like see it, you have this visceral experience of like, oh wow, this is a situation, right? It's not something that I would want to find myself in. But I, honestly, like this was the experience that I had. I mean, growing up and like just being in Hawaii, growing up, where you just sort of like notice these details of like you just look up and there's just like water damage near near the HVAC, or there's like stains on the windows, or there's cracks, and there's just so much water damage just in a place that rains a lot, right? Like we're in Portland, there's a lot of mold everywhere, and I think that gets lost in a lot of the art or the world building that we're sort of like used to. And for me, it was I think it was necessary to show this stuff so that people understood. People have a feeling of like, what does it look like to exist in a world where this is what you get, and that's something that like you can't explain. You just show it, and then you have people experience it, and then they take from that experience what they want. And so, yes, you sort of from page one to the end of it, you see me introducing, Roscoe and the world that he's living in, and the journey that he goes through. And it alludes to things, but I think the visuals of comics, the visuals that are represented are things that you pull from yourself, right? People might notice the stains on the windows or the stains on the walls, and they might have a memory of like actually being in classrooms that were like that, or you probably never did, and then it was like, why is this like? Why would you render this, or why would you have this? Why would you have this character being in this space? It's like this is something that's very relevant to me, and it's something that is relevant to this character, and so my job is to just, tell the story and share the experience of these characters that already exist.
When you say tell the story, it sounds like you're also letting the scenery kind of tell its own story, apart from like the captions that you have.
Yeah.
Like there's history in this world.
Yeah. This is beyond just one character navigating a world, because he's not the only person that's affected by it. And I think that reflects that reflects the world around us. I just go back to, the infamous, summer of 2020, where we're all just trying to get through the pandemic, and then there's all this stuff just going on around us, and we're often just caught up in it, and a lot of it you really can't control. You just sort of just find a way to navigate it. And that's really all we're really trying to figure out and do, especially for little kids. It's like they just grow up in this world and they're just like trying to make sense of it, right? Yeah. And so I feel like we do that as adults too, though.
So, continuing to move on, you're in medical school right now, but you have a bit of a background in education. You've taught people how to use augmented reality. I think you have a few Skillshare classes on world building, and comics have a stigma for being generally uneducational, but you're currently pursuing them as a method of education, is that correct?
Yeah, it's funny because, like you said, I'm in medical school, and I'm like regularly talking with like the learning specialists and all that stuff, and trying to find ways to integrate sequential images, which is sort of like the the academic way to explain it, but essentially trying to find a way to integrate comics into medical education. And the experience that I have with that, with my educational background, just teaching a lot of people, and teaching a lot of people in a variety of different areas, whether it's heavy tech or more creative or just general education. It's we all, like most of our experiences just living are very visual. And so when we're forced to just look at a block of text and then memorize it, we have a very poor experience with that. But then if you watch a movie, a 2-hour movie, you remember a lot more than you would if you read a 30-minute block of text. Like that's just, there's a lot of research that just proves that point. And we all have that visceral experience of trying to get through something that takes 10, 20 minutes, but then memorizing something that was visually stimulating that, spanned across hours. And so I've been really exploring this idea of like how to mitigate that so that it improves the effects of education. Because at the end of the day, we all need to know how to read, we all need to know how to do all these things. And I think comics has this happy medium of combining text and visuals in a way that makes sense. And there's a lot of time and energy in the approach of combining those to where it creates a life of its own. And so, me, as an educator, and also still a student, I feel like I will always be a student at this point. Me as an educator and a student, it's how can you use creativity as a means to positively impact people? And comics just happens to be just the answer to that. If there's another way that's sustainable, animation is great, but animation is 24 frames per second, right? So one image that I would do in comics, I would have to do 24 of those to have that same impact. And so yeah, just comics. Me as a medical student, I'm trying to use comics to one, do better in school, and then two, help mitigate the problems that we see in medical education, just in education in general. And so I think that, if people were to say, oh yeah, comics are for, kids or whatever, it's like, well, I'm trying to be a doctor and I'm using this and I think that it's cool. And so unless you can find some other doctors that just that think otherwise, it's like, well, your opinion is cool, but
you don't think that comics just belong for like the beginner level in terms of education? You think that they can be used at all levels of education?
Oh yeah. I mean, because at this point, it's like, a lot of the resources that I'm seeing that are given to us as medical students are, we have our lectures, we obviously have books that we can read, and then they send us YouTube videos. There's YouTube channels that they suggest that we like subscribe to and we watch, and it's all visual. It's like there's no audio learned stuff. A lot of the resources that we're given are, either PowerPoint slide decks that have images and pictures, or it's people on YouTube that are at a whiteboard and they're drawing out all the mechanisms and they're showing this stuff with they're visually representing all these things. And so to me, it feels that there should be something that goes further than just somebody drawing on a whiteboard on YouTube,
Right.
and with
Medicine sounds like something that's very visual based. Like I don't want my doctor to misplace my lungs and my heart.
right?
Yeah.
Like anatomy is a real thing, and physiology has impacts. If your spleen is in a different area, it has an impact on your body. And so all these things that are so visually based in our lives are not dissimilar from from how we should be, educated. And I think it's just from my experience, just sort of being in this, space minimally, or just being in the hard sciences as a creative, the things that I sort of expect just aren't there, and mainly because people just aren't creative in this space. Like, people aren't animators. I mean, that's just what it comes down to. There's no animators just going out and trying to be doctors. And so I find I feel fortunate to sort of like be able to have the experiences that I've had creatively, and then going into these spaces and being able to navigate it. But then I also see that other people are struggling in ways that I feel like there's an answer to it, because I've seen this in other areas. And so, no, I don't know. I'm still figuring it out. This is all still new. And like I said, there's no animators going into medical school. So it's, I'm still.
If anything, I think there are medical school students going into comics. I know Osamu Tezuka, the godfather of manga, is one of those people.
Yes. It's because it's very technical. And I think there's a lot of overlap. And I think the output of the creativity gets, overshadows the technical nature of the medium. And it's very procedural. I think medicine, there's things that you do and there's things that you don't. And that's the same for any creative process. You wouldn't ink before you pencil. And you probably want to write out a script before you try to do 20 pages of comics. Like, there's just certain things that you do. And when you have that experience of creating, and then you have that experience of studying and all that, there's a bit of nostalgia. There's a level of familiarity that you just sort of like have in that experience.
We're nearly out of time, but I do really want to ask you about how you want your creations to challenge stereotypes. And when I hear that, I assume that you have probably experienced stereotypes. How do you challenge stereotyping in your work?
I think with my work at this point, because I found myself in this, I always say I found or stumbled into this very interesting situation that I'm in because of my work or because of my ideas. When you think about innovation, you think about advancements in technology, the average person is hard-pressed to think that you see that in, you see that in print, and you see that with people of color, specifically Black people. I mean, there's whole campaigns of people trying to just redefine what technology and so this idea of futurism looks like with Black people included into it. And so you sort of take this pinnacle of an idea of augmented reality or emerging technology, and then you're combining that with, paper, which is the most archaic thing known to man at this point, and you combine the two and you say that's innovation, and then you sort of slap, Black people on top of it, and you say this is the pinnacle of innovation. I think in and of itself, just at face value, it challenges the idea of what the future looks like, right? And I think and then it becomes used as an example, and it sets the precedent for it. And I think that's really impactful, because if people don't reference, if your only references for the future is, touching digital stuff that doesn't actually exist, and only including white people into it, then when you're confronted with this idea of, okay, what about people of color? Why are people getting lost? Oh, why are there no more printers? Or why is all this, like, the things that we sort of grow up on, you become disconnected from it. And then it becomes perpetuated, right? And so for me, you know, being able to have a group of kids from the Boys and Girls Club come in, see this on a wall, be like, oh yeah, this looks like the Boondocks, or this looks like this or that. I love this stuff. But then you say, okay, you know, like this, you know, there's an extra element to it that that allows you to explore in this new way. It inspires people, and people internalize that. And really, I mean, seeing is believing. You know, if you see this and you experience it and you relate to it, then you're more inclined to pursue it. And you know, so it's, you know, that the idea of like challenging, you know, stereotypes and all that, it's a constant conversation that evolves and grows. And for me at this point, it's like I just want to be, I want to show that Black people belong in emerging tech. And this is what happens when Black people are in it. You know, you get to innovate, but then you also get to be culturally relevant. And just the stuff that I've just shown on YouTube, you know, has led me to do stuff with the Wall Street Journal, and you know, consulting with a lot of tech companies and stuff, all from this very thing that people didn't really bat an eye about. And so I just sort of just leave it at that.
We're just about out of time, so thank you so much, Stephen Christian, for talking to me, for displaying your art. It was wonderful to be here, and thank you.
Yeah.